Did you know that in 1951, the US came this close to starting World War III? It's not a story your teachers will tell you, but it's true. Oh, and by the way, if you've ever wanted to support our humble little channel, we finally have merch. Check out the Stars and Stripes pin set, it's very lovely. But I digress. Here is the man who almost dragged America into nuclear war. Douglas MacArthur, arguably the most controversial US general of the 20th century. In case you don't know him, a fact which would totally bewilder him, Douglas MacArthur was one of America's most decorated military leaders. He was a strong yet paradoxical figure. He came from an influential family, a sort of military aristocrat destined from birth for the armed forces. He went to the most elite army school in America and, of course, graduated at the top of his class. He rose rapidly through the ranks during the First World War, earning 7 Silver Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and a bunch of other awards, both domestic and foreign. By 1919, he was occupying Germany, and in the years between the 2 world wars, he rose to become the US Army Chief of Staff. Yet, despite his elite background and his position at the very top of the US military, he breathed an aura of populism and presented himself as a bastion against the corrupt Washington establishment. He had an almost Trumpian ego and built himself a cult of personality in the military, which of course led to frequent clashes with his superiors. It should therefore come as no surprise that MacArthur's later career saw him commanding places as far away from the US as possible, like the Philippines during World War II. When the Japanese Empire conquered the Philippines, MacArthur swore that he would return. And when he did return victoriously, the whole of America celebrated him as a national hero. MacArthur was the one who received Japan's surrender after the 2 atomic bombings, and it was he who oversaw America's occupation of the islands. His ego and grandeur grew over the next 4 years as he brought democracy to the islands, instituted Japan's new constitution, and basically reshaped Japan to his liking. During this time, MacArthur was also in charge of South Korea, though he didn't pay it much attention. Korea, as we all know, was divided along the 38th parallel when Japan surrendered, with communists in the north and ostensible Democrats in the south. This division was supposed to be temporary, but like many Cold War arrangements, it turned into a permanent crisis, much like Communist China and Taiwan, which we covered in another SideQuest. In any case, Kim Il-sung decided to take matters into his own hands and to unify the Korean peninsula by force. And so, in June 1950, North Korea invaded the South, with weapons generously provided by Mao and Stalin. By the time General MacArthur had drank his morning coffee, the North Koreans were well on their way to Seoul. The South Korean army was badly outnumbered and lacked planes and tanks, so it began collapsing within days. In the eyes of the Americans, this was very much looking like the first steps towards World War III. Lest we forget, just within the last year, the Soviet Union had tested its first nuclear bomb, and Mao had completed the communist takeover of mainland China. President Truman pushed for an emergency session of the United Nations, and within 2 weeks, an American expeditionary force was assembled to save South Korea. The man entrusted to lead this force was, of course, General MacArthur. He took up this position with great enthusiasm and saw it as a call from destiny to finally wage proper war on communism. Unfortunately for him, by the time America's forces could actually be mustered, South Korea had almost entirely been conquered. Only a sliver of territory in the southeast remained, the so-called Busan perimeter. For MacArthur, the war seemed over before it had even begun, and so a radical strategy was needed. Against the advice of almost everyone else in the US military, MacArthur planned a daring naval invasion deep behind enemy lines to cut off the North Koreans. The plan was bold and had a very high risk of going wrong, which is exactly why the North Koreans didn't expect it and why it worked. The Americans cut off the North Korean army's supply lines and routed it in short order, pushing it out of South Korea entirely in mere weeks. MacArthur was praised as a genius and was awarded another bunch of medals. At this point, MacArthur did what any other military genius would do. He pushed his luck. And speaking of pushing your luck with bold tactical decisions, I think you'll enjoy playing Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. It's a fast-paced tactical strategy game set in the eternal conflict of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, where you build a roster of champions from over 22 playable factions and send them into skirmishes. I've always had a soft spot for games where you can outthink your enemy rather than just out-click them, and Tacticus very much scratches that itch. You have to figure out when to strike, when to hold back, and when to do the MacArthur thing and massively overextend because of your ego. There's PvE campaigns, PvP live events, guild wars, and regular updates with new champions and limited-time content. Just a few weeks ago, we got the Blood Angels Assault Terminator Casolary, and on the 9th of August, to celebrate the game's 4th anniversary, we're getting the new Crusade mode, bringing all-out PvP on a galactic scale. It unlocks at level 20, so make sure to get started now so you're strong enough in time. And for a limited time, you'll also receive a special goodie bag with resources, tickets and shards if you use the promo code QuestTacticus. Just click the link in the description or scan this QR code to assemble your army and wage galactic war. But back to our story. MacArthur did push his luck pretty soon after his successful invasion. Rather than stopping at the former border, as was the operation's original goal, he pushed deeper into North Korea to reunify the peninsula under the South. President Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were worried that China would intervene, but MacArthur's popularity outweighed their concerns. When intelligence came in that 400,000 Chinese troops were amassing in Manchuria, MacArthur brushed it off as a bluff by Mao. In his eyes, the Chinese were a weak army, so even if they did intervene, they'd just be slaughtered, and they'd also be giving him a convenient excuse to expand the war into China. When China did attack, supposedly with a volunteer army so that it wouldn't really be a war, MacArthur got a big, fat reality check. In just over 2 months, the Americans were pushed back to the 38th parallel, with thousands dying in the retreat. By this point, President Truman was looking for a diplomatic way out of the conflict, which was becoming increasingly unpopular back home. He was also deathly afraid of the Soviet Union joining the party. MacArthur was furious and was pushing for the opposite: more forces and escalation against China. Initially, he proposed dropping nuclear bombs in Manchuria to create an impassable radioactive belt between China and Korea. Truman naturally rejected that plan, but MacArthur persisted. He called for a naval blockade and aerial bombing of China, followed up by an amphibious invasion from Taiwan so that Chiang Kai-shek could finally get his revenge. All these unhinged proposals were almost certain to cause World War III, not least because the Soviet Union had just signed a mutual defense treaty with China. MacArthur's pride, however, was too great. So instead of submitting to the president's orders of limiting the Korean War, he tried to escalate it outside the chain of command. He reached out to foreign diplomats to assure them that America was committed to waging war with China. He also sent a letter directly to Congress, advocating for a wider war and publicly criticizing President Truman. Worse yet, he sabotaged the peace talks between the US and China, right when they were starting, by publicly demanding China's surrender and threatening a blockade. For President Truman, this was the last straw. He took the big political risk of firing the extremely popular war hero general in the middle of a war. Ironically, news of his dismissal reached MacArthur right when he was executing his most brazen scheme yet for expanding the war. On the very same day of his firing, MacArthur had commanded 18 ships from the 7th Fleet to the coast of China near Taiwan. He had previously received approval to retaliate against Chinese provocations, and apparently he was trying to fabricate one from scratch. MacArthur had one of the ships moved to within 3 miles of mainland China as bait, then had planes do mock bombing dives over the nearby city of Shantou, hoping to provoke a response. The Chinese did respond by surrounding the lone American ship in a tense standoff that lasted 5 hours. Luckily, nobody was trigger-happy, and no shots were fired, so escalation was averted. MacArthur was officially relieved of his post, but his ambitions were far from over. He returned to US soil for the first time in over a decade and was greeted as a war hero with triumphant fanfare. In Washington, D.C., he drew 250,000 people along Pennsylvania Avenue as he made his way towards the Capitol with Air Force jets racing above. Reporters at the time noted the surreal fear they felt that if MacArthur had tried to seize the White House, he may very well have succeeded with the crowd's support. Thankfully, he didn't try to take power by force, and by the 1952 election next year, his name had faded from the headlines. President Truman, however, never recovered politically from firing MacArthur, and in 1952, he didn't even try to run for re-election. History did vindicate Truman's actions in the decades since, but he only lived until 1972, so he didn't get to see most of that. In any case, if you enjoyed this brief march through hypothetical Armageddon, consider supporting us on Patreon. Also consider getting our first ever merch, the Stars and Stripes pin set, linked in the description. Let us know in the comments what other topics you'd like us to cover, and stay tuned for the next delusionally grandomanic episode of SideQuest. What was MacArthur's favourite fast food? The Big Mac.